Ah, yes. Se in Spanish. One of our favorite words as Spanish learners. Nah, not really. No, not even close. Well, today I'm going to teach you exactly how to use se in Spanish because it can mean a bunch of different things. But hopefully by the end of this video, you will be very clear on when and why we use it. The first and one of the most common uses of se is the reflexive use. So a reflexive verb in Spanish is simply a verb that one does to oneself. So, for example, ella se baña. She bathes herself. Okay? No one else is doing the bathing to her. She does that to herself. And therefore, we would use the reflexive pronoun se. So let's say I want to say, I bathe myself. I wouldn't just say, yo baño, because it sounds like I'm bathing something or someone else that is not myself. Yo baño, blah, blah, blah. When what I'm trying to say is, I bathe myself. So I would just say, yo me baño. I bathe myself. That's why we say something like, me lavo los dientes. I brush my teeth, right? I'm not brushing anything else, and I'm not brushing anyone else's teeth. I'm brushing my teeth, and therefore we need to use that reflexive pronoun. So here, se can be that third person singular, right? Ella se baña. Can also be the plural. So it can also be ellas se bañan. They bathe themselves. Okay? Now, notice in this example, right? If I say ella baña, I don't know what I'm talking about. So I could say, ella baña al perro, for example. She bathes the dog, right? But what I'm really trying to say is she bathes herself. So ella se baña, okay? So that's the first use of se as a reflexive, okay? Remember, a reflexive is simply something that we do to ourselves, okay? The next is the passive se, and it's probably one of the more confusing uses of se. I really don't use it a whole lot. And actually, what I've noticed with native Spanish speakers here in Mexico is that many times they won't do this se vendieron idea. They will just say vendieron. Like, for example, ya te hablaron. Did they already speak to you, for example? We don't know necessarily who we're talking about, but that is when the passive se comes into use. So, se vendieron las computadoras. Okay? Se representing the people or person that we don't know who sold the computers. Also, notice how vender is now being conjugated based off of las computadoras. So now this is being conjugated based off of this noun. It's a bit tricky, but the idea here is simply to remember that we don't know who or what sold these computers, and therefore we will say se. Like I said, I don't use this one a whole lot, so if this confuses you or you struggle with it, don't worry about it too much. Okay? Next example, se rentó la casa. Okay? The house was rented. We don't know who rented the house, but we know the house was rented. Once again, rentó being conjugated based off of la casa. This is the preterite tense, aka the past. So se rentó la casa. The house was rented. Okay? Passive se, a little bit tricky. Another very, very important use of se is this idea of le and les becoming se. So if you haven't learned about indirect object pronouns in Spanish, you can check those out here on my YouTube channel or by clicking the link in the video description in my Fluent Spanish Speaker Academy. But the idea here is that when we have something like le or les in a sentence combined with a direct object pronoun, so something like lo or la, los or las, we cannot have se. Le or les. So you cannot have Lilo and Stitch in Spanish. That's how I like to teach my students, okay? So you can't have lelo or leslo or les las, so on and so forth. You have to turn these into se. So if we look at these examples, we can see in this example, I have ya le lo dije. For example, I already told it to him, okay? Notice how I added the el here. If this is confusing, don't worry. I have an entire lesson on indirect object pronouns that goes way more into depth on this. In this lesson, I'm just trying to teach you why and when we use the word se, because as you can see, se can mean many different things depending on the context of the sentence. But the idea here is you cannot say lelo. You cannot have Lilo and Stitch in Spanish. So le now becomes se. So now the correct sentence would be, ya se lo dije a él. Okay? I don't need to put a él. The only reason I'm putting it there is because it provides extra context. So if you and I were having a conversation and we already had the context that I was talking about him, right? Then I could just say, ya se lo dije to you, and you would understand that I was talking about him. However, if I were to just randomly, out of nowhere, tell you, ya se lo dije, you're going to be like, what did you tell and who did you tell it to? I have no idea what you're talking about, okay? So object pronouns can only be used when we have that prior context, okay? Ya se lo dije. So I already told it to him, okay? Same thing here, right? Les, las, di. That is incorrect, okay? You cannot have Lilo and Stitch in Spanish or Lilos and Stitches in Spanish. Les, las, di a ellas, okay? So I gave them to them. Sounds weird, but that's pretty much what that translates to. So now les becomes se. Se las di. I gave them to them. Okay, so this might mean the flowers, for example. Les di las flores a ellas. Se las di. Okay, this can be very tricky, right? My main goal is so that you can understand when and why we use se. But if you're struggling with these object pronouns and why and when and how we use them, check out the videos here on this channel. Or like I said, click the link in the video description to check out our Fluent Spanish Speaker Academy. You have all the in-depth lessons on these things in the academy. Okay? And finally, the impersonal se. Okay? So something like se vive bien en Antártida. One lives well in Antarctica, right? I'm pretty sure that's true. Look, I gotta have fun, all right? I want you to have fun. I want you to learn, but I gotta have fun too. So, se vive bien en Antártida. Okay, one lives well in Antarctica. Now, in English, I would say you, right? So I could say, oh yeah, you can have a great life in Antarctica, for example. You can have a great life in Mexico, whatever. The idea here is we're not necessarily talking about you specifically, right? Tú vives bien en Antártida. I'm talking about you specifically in that case. Whereas with se vive bien en Antártida means one lives well in Antarctica. People in general live well, okay? So it's very common in English to say, oh yeah, you can have a great life in Antarctica, okay? But what we're really trying to say is that people in general can have a great life in Antarctica. That is what the impersonal se is. My favorite translation of this would be one, okay? One lives well, one eats, one does, so on and so forth, okay? So for example, no se debe comer papas. One should not eat potatoes, or you should not eat potatoes, all right? Once again, I don't necessarily agree with this statement. I just want it to be silly, but you get the idea. No se debe comer papas. One should not eat potatoes, okay? I'm not talking about you specifically, however, this could, in English, translate as you should not eat potatoes. But what I mean by that is people in general should not eat potatoes. That's what the impersonal says. Once again, I really like the translation of one. So, one should not eat potatoes. No se debe comer papas, okay? And finally, don't get se, this se, confused with se, okay? Se with an accent on it is coming from the verb saber. So when I say something like no sé, that means I don't know. It has nothing to do with this pronoun sé. Okay? I know this is a lot of information. Like I said, this is just a quick video on the different uses of sé. I have all the in-depth lessons in the academy. Check it out by clicking the link in the video description. But there you go. Reflexive sé, passive sé, le and les becoming sé, and the impersonal sé, and also not getting it confused with this kind of sé. The most common ones you're going to see are the reflexive sé. This one you don't see it too much, and then probably this guy right here, the les and le becoming sé. Bueno, muchas gracias por ver este video. Espero que hayas aprendido algo nuevo. Like I said, click the link in the video description if you want to join the Fluent Spanish Speaker Academy. I've said that like 20 million times in this video. Muchas gracias y que tengas buen día. Hasta luego.